Welcome to our fourth week as we journey with Paul in his letter to Rome. Last week we experienced Paul's condemnation of the Jewish community, pretty harsh, and that was his own community. Remember, he was of the Jewish faith when he wrote this letter, because many Jews were also Christian. The condemnation that Paul started out with in the book of Romans was twofold. First of all, he felt the Jews had disobeyed their own law. Deuteronomy 6:4, love God with your heart, soul, and strength. That was one of the reasons for condemnation. And the second was by judging others, for by judging others, the judgment that they were executing was worse than whatever they were condemning the other person in doing. And so a twofold condemnation of his own faith community. Now, as we continue this week, starting with Romans chapter 2:17 and continuing through chapter 3:31, Paul unpacks the same condemnation and God's way out of that condemnation. And so that's what our journey is going to be this week. Unpacking that condemnation as it continues, and then God providing a way out. Now, as we've explored from time to time to understand, people who feel chosen, that path is full of danger and peril. The alternative to being chosen is to feel like you're being sent. The Acts of the Apostles or the Acts of the Sent Ones. And so Paul really is attacking those who feel like they have been chosen. And he's condemning them, if you will, from the perspective that he has been sent. So let's look, first of all, of how he unpacks the perils of being chosen. There's three of them. First of all, chapter 2, verse 17 names the problem. That because one has heard, one knows, and because they know, they're boastful. This is the way it reads. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast of your relation to God, you see, you know the law and you boast about who you are in relationship to God because you know you brag. One way of referring to this is bragging rights. Bragging rights come as a consequence of being privileged, good luck, being chosen, and therefore you become a braggart and boastful. So that's the first peril of believing you were chosen. But then he unpacks another one in verse 21. He says, you then who teach others will not teach yourself. That's a peril. Jesus called it hypocrisy, acting or pretending. Practice what you preach, is a call to faithfulness of the preacher. But in this case, it was practice what you teach. That's a pretty good summary. And the radical example of one who practiced what they taught, practicing what they were teaching, was Jesus. Because you can't find any discrepancy between Jesus' teachings and his life. And what enabled Jesus to be the kind of person that we all follow is not that he was just a teacher, but he practiced what he taught. He sacrificed his life in the name of love for all. He taught it, he lived it. But one of the perils of being chosen is you don't do that. As Paul said, you teach others, but you're not willing to teach yourself. That's the second peril. But the third peril is to depend upon outward signs, symbols, if you will, as confirmation of being chosen. Now, Paul chose and examines the practice of male circumcision as such a symbol. You see, to have the male in the family circumcised, it had become a symbol of adherence to the covenant that the Jews had with God. If a male was circumcised, that means that they adhered to the covenant that God had with God's chosen people. And Paul says, you've broken the covenant. Therefore, outward to be seen, circumcision is of no value. The circumcision that really counts is the inward circumcision of the heart. Now, remember Deuteronomy 6:4, love your God with your heart, soul, and might. And then in verse chapter 2:29, he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and real circumcision is of the heart. See how tied Paul is to the essence of the law as he explains the perils of being chosen. For Christians today, that's very, very important, because wearing a cross is often the modern symbol like circumcision was of old, when one who wears a cross is wearing it as a validation of their identity rather than wearing it pointing to the love of God. Because symbols are intended to point to the truth. The truth for those of us who follow Jesus is that God is love. And so this third peril of being chosen, pretty relevant to today. So now, this is we've unpacked. Paul really unloaded it on his faith community. So now we turn to chapter 3 as Paul addresses the way out of this human predicament. The way out's the same for Jews and Gentiles. Now, that in itself is an important note, because he said there's no partiality between the two. The human predicament is one of idolatrous behavior, sinful attitudes, sinful lifestyle. And in this chapter, Paul introduces the radical understanding that humanity is made right, not by the works they do, but by the faith they have, believing that the source of righteousness is God. The divine gift of love is the source of righteousness. Now, the Greek word that's translated righteousness is exactly the same word that is translated justifies or justification. So this is where the phrase comes from. You're justified by faith. You're made righteous by faith. Righteousness and justification are synonyms translated from the same word. And in verse 324, this is the way Paul states it. They are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption which is in Christ Jesus. You're justified by the works. You do. You're justified by faith, made right in faith, and as a consequence of that, you do good works. But you aren't justified by your good works, trying to get there. You're justified by faith because they're already there. That's a radical difference. Right living is the consequence of being justified by God, not acts attempting to experience God's favor. Now you see, Paul believes that humanity has broken the sacred covenant with God. Humanity is helpless and cannot restore the covenant. But God can, and God redeems. The word we just read was redemption. God redeems, and redemption means buying back. God buys back humans, justified humans, by the gift of divine love. Therefore, we see in Romans 3 the breeding ground, if you will, the radical understanding of justification by faith, which was the launching pad for Martin Luther to start the protesting movement that became the Protestant expression of Christianity. And John Wesley, again, anchored his understanding of his own faith in justification by faith. Again, the breeding ground of that is Romans 3. Now, Paul concludes Romans 3 with an important note to the Jewish community when he writes about this understanding of justification by faith. All the Jewish community could hear this as saying, you're overthrowing the law. But listen to what he writes. Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we're upholding the law. Love God with your heart, soul, and might is what Paul is trying to uphold. And he believes justification by faith is our experience of that, as it was his experience of that on the road to Damascus. You see, Jesus taught the same thing. Remember, he said, I came not to destroy the law. I came to fulfill the law. So we see at the end of this chapter 3, all the, lambasting the Jewish community and then talking about the way out is what God provides. Then the footnote of the chapter is, and what we're really talking about is upholding the law, not overthrowing it. So in Acts 2:17 through 3:31, we experience Paul unpacking the predicament of the Jews, same predicament of the Gentiles, helpless humanity, broken the covenant, and the divine answer to this brokenness is God's redeeming act of divine love through Jesus is revealed in his life and his teachings. Now that's a lot to think about. Here's some questions that might help you along the way. What are the examples in 2021 of the perils of being chosen? Knowing and boasting, not practicing what one teaches, and thirdly, depending on symbols to prove God's favoritism. Secondly, why is works righteousness so prevalent and popular today? Thirdly, what is the difference between one boasting about one's own salvation, I'm saved, for instance, and boasting about God, who by grace makes one right? Finally, what's your response to the portrait of Paul that we're helpless? Without the love of God, we're helpless. Enjoy your thinking during the week, and we'll look forward to visiting about it in Church School on Sunday. Thank you.